Let's go over to our spotlight then for this evening, and this is coming from Saudi Arabia because the Saudi Arabian cabinet has now approved sweeping economic reforms aimed at moving the country away from its dependence on oil profits. As part of the Vision 2030 plan, the country wants to ensure it can live without oil by the year 2020. According to the blueprint, shares worth about 4% of Aramco, a company valued at up to $2.5 trillion, will be sold. Some of the proceeds will go towards a sovereign wealth fund worth $2 trillion. Steps will also be taken to diversify the economy, including investments in mineral mining and expanding military production. That will be done for the first time. In fact, the new plan is hugely significant. Close to 80%, remember, of Saudi Arabia's revenues currently comes from oil. It has been hit, of course, by the falling oil prices in the past 1 year or so. And CNBC's Hedley Gamble is in Riyadh. She brings us the very latest from there.
New details emerging today about the Saudi National Transformation Plan. This is a plan to diversify the kingdom's economy away from oil revenues, and it's essentially based on a $30 per barrel price. The deputy crown prince, the son of the king, Mohammed bin Salman, saying earlier today that he expects to create a sovereign wealth fund bigger than any other in the world, valued at between $2.5 and $3 trillion. And part of that, of course, is going to be based on the sale of Saudi Aramco. That IPO is expected in 2017. They're expected to sell just between 4 and 5% of that company, but he says the value of Saudi Aramco could be even over $3 trillion. Now, of course, he's also announced plans for taxation for the first time in the kingdom, and also that they're going to try and develop their own defense industry. This is huge for a country like Saudi Arabia. They spend billions of dollars on weapon systems from the United States to Europe to the UK. Over and over, they've said that they really want to diversify this economy, and it now looks as if between taxation, a defense industry, and, of course, investments abroad and at home, they're going to finally be able to do that. One note, of course, is whether or not women would be allowed to drive. A lot of speculation over the last several days in particular as to whether or not women would be allowed to take the wheel inside the kingdom, but so far that hasn't been the case. But the prince did, of course, come out and say that women were going to be a substantial part of this country's economy and getting this country on the right track going forward. Guys?
And for more of that, I'm now joined by Professor Jean-Francois Seznec. He's the adjunct professor at the Johns Hopkins School of Advanced International Studies and is attached to the Middle East Institute as an expert. Thank you very much, Professor, for joining us here on The Big Picture. The reforms, the Saudi Vision 2030, it was expected. It was because considering the fact that when the oil prices started that downward spiral, many thought that what will be the long-term implications for a country which is so dependent on oil as for a source of revenue, considering the fact that in 2015, last year, their overall budget had reached $200 billion. But considering that this was already on expected lines, how do you see today's announcement in terms of has it met up with the expectations that many people had from the Deputy Crown Prince?
Well, I think the expectations are very high and they're very good. I think the Deputy Crown Prince wants to cut the dependence on oil, and I think he will succeed. There's already a very large chemical industry in the kingdom. There's a very large fertilizer, large metal industries, and they have all manners of downstream efforts. So by making the Saudi Aramco more transparent and putting money in a large public investment fund for investments, I think they will continue to improve this situation very well. So I suspect that, by 2030, as the vision gives, that they will be much less dependent on oil than they are today.
All right, Professor. One big takeaway, of course, is the way in which Aramco has been valued at about $2.5 to $3 trillion, and the government has also said that they want to off-stake about between 4 and 5% stake in the company. Many would wonder how reliable this valuation is. Can you throw us some light on that?
Well, I can try, but the one thing we seem to forget is that the actual assets, the oil, is in the ground, and that oil belongs to the state, not to Saudi Aramco. So what the main value of Saudi Aramco is the long-term leases they have, and that could be valued at perhaps $1 trillion, depending on how you go about it, considering they have 269 billion barrels of oil in the ground. It is optimistic to think it's 3 trillion, but on the other hand, it all depends what valuation you put on their profits. The cost of pumping oil in Saudi Arabia is probably today, that's what I hear anyway, is below $4 a barrel. So their profits are very, very high. And if you did put a multiple of 20 on that, as say Exxon would do, then you might get to another $1 trillion as well. So I'm not sure where it goes. They have about $500 billion worth of downstream assets in refineries and whatnot. So I think in the long term, it may go to 2 trillion or something of this nature, but it will be very, very high. That's all I can tell you.
Right, fair enough, Professor. You know, considering the fact that the sort of influence the public sector has in Saudi Arabia, many commentators are now, you know, sort of coming out and they're sort of, you know, expressing their disappointment in the government's inability to bridge the gap between the public sector and the private sector. And somebody was just giving me these statistics: 2/3 workforce in Saudi Arabia belongs to the public sector, and private sector wages as of now accounts for just 3 to 4% of the country's GDP. In terms of bridging the gap between public and private sector, are you also a bit disappointed in the context of the reforms that they have announced today?
Well, I really cannot speak to that because I have not seen the details of the reforms from this morning. But the fact is that there will be much more dependence on the private sector to create jobs, definitely. Now, another statistic, if you like, is that 85% of the private sector is peopled by foreigners, and that they have to change. But it also means they're going to have a lot of inflation in the process, because salaries would have to come up to very much higher level to hire the Saudis. The fact is, though, that the private sector is very eager to invest. So if they can get more money through the public investment fund and whatnot to invest in their own businesses, especially the small and medium firms, and they are helped to continue training the Saudis better, then yeah, there could be a lot of step forward to change that the ratio you talked about and the difference between the two. The future is the private sector. There's no doubt about that.
Right. When it comes to, you know, economic reforms, clearly the Deputy Crown Prince has, you know, has given us a blueprint. But on the social front, you know, things still, you know, it sort of has not lived up to the expectations, because there were hopes that finally perhaps, you know, the Deputy Crown Prince might just come in and say that women, you know, would finally be allowed to drive. But again, no such announcement, you know, has come in as of now. So in that sense, do you think, you know, it's, you know, the Saudi Arabian government may have missed the bus?
I don't know that. You know, I'm sure that is such a political issue and a hot potato in Saudi Arabia between the conservatives and the more forward-thinking folks, that I'm not sure we'll see any big decision on that very issue in the next few months. So I don't know if they have missed the bus, but it's not going to happen very easily. So, right. Thank you.
Finally, okay, thank you, Professor. Thank you for your time. That was Professor giving us a more in-depth understanding of what were the big political and the economic ramifications of those reforms that were announced by the Saudi Arabian cabinet a little while ago.